Welcome back. We are ready to start. If you can kindly take your seats. This afternoon, we will focus on how U.S. independence was perceived in the vast Spanish Empire, and we will also discover the relations between indigenous groups and Afro-American groups with the Spanish Empire. All three professors will take your questions at the end of their lectures. We will now hear from Professor Iván Jaksic, who will talk about impact and perceptions of the United States independence in the Spanish Empire. Professor Jaksic is currently director of Stanford University's Being Overseas Studies programs in Santiago, Chile, and director of the Andrés Bello Chair at Adolfo Ibáñez University. He received his MA and PhD in history from the State University of New York. He has taught at Berkeley, Wisconsin, and Notre Dame in the United States, and held research appointments at Harvard, Oxford, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. Professor Jaksic is the author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of more than 30 books, including Academic Rebels in Chile, The Role of Philosophy in Higher Education and Politics, Andrés Bello, Scholarship and Nation Building in 19th Century Latin America, and The Hispanic World, An American Intellectual Life, 1820-1880. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jaksic.
Good afternoon. Thank you for still being here. I just want to express my thanks to the Ramon Areces Foundation, the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, and especially the Daughters of the American Revolution. It was a cold Wisconsin day in the winter of 1992 that I became a US citizen. It was in a courtroom. It was in a courtroom, a rather institutional place, but lo and behold, I went into the lobby, and there were the Daughters of the American Revolution warming us up with coffee and cookies. The one thing that they asked was get information about voting. It turned out that I have never voted in my life, because when I came of age to vote, there was a coup in my country. And so I did not vote until I became a citizen. And I have done that ever since the 1993 elections, even though these days I have to do it with absentee ballots. So thank you. As the gracious introduction mentioned, in this panel we are trying to address kind of the resonance and the impact on the lives of people beyond Spain and in the larger Spanish Empire. I know I don't have a PowerPoint, for which I apologize, but just to assure you that I have some organization, I want to cover about 4 or 5 points of various length, but all of them brief. On the one hand, I want to talk about the conditions of Spanish America at the time of the American Revolution. I also want to mention something about the early perceptions of the United States on the part of Spanish Americans. And on the other side of the coin, US perceptions of Spanish America. And then finally, some of the legacies of the debates about the significance of the American Revolution in Spanish America. I think my story really begins, as has been mentioned here in the last couple of days, it begins in Cuba in 1762. The British occupation of Havana, really, it was a major earthquake in the Spanish Empire. That is, it was too close for comfort, especially for the fleets, especially for the commerce. Something had to be done about it. It turns out that Havana was recovered fairly quickly, but to prevent that from happening again, Spain had to revamp the empire and think differently in geopolitical terms. Gonzalo Quintero yesterday reminds us that there was a flurry of reforms, and the most important of which are going from 2 viceroyalties to 4 viceroyalties. The new viceroyalties were in New Granada, the other viceroyalty in La Plata. The latter was established in 1776, which I hope is a date easy to remember. It had to do with a geopolitical decision to shift from the Pacific to the Atlantic, something that will have long-term consequences for countries, especially on the Pacific coast. But moving the silver into Buenos Aires to avoid the kind of bottleneck of the Caribbean. Okay? Most of the shipments of silver from Peru went through what today Panama, and they had to kind of negotiate between Florida and Cuba to get past the Atlantic to Spain. And now it was easier, safer to go into Buenos Aires. But the trip from the mountains of Potosí to Buenos Aires would take a good 4 months. Okay? But most importantly, over the long term, it kind of shaped the national boundaries of the then independent countries. It also shifted kind of the communities that belonged to one particular viceroyalty in one moment, and then the next they were in another viceroyalty. So it's a time of a lot of flux. Now, I would add to the viceroyalties something that is also equally significant, and that is the creation of new captaincy generals. All of this is part of the geopolitical arrangement so that Spanish America would be better defended, which had also very, very important consequences in the long run. There were some captaincy generals, but others were added. That is, Chile, for instance, became a captaincy general. But even more important is the creation of intendancies. That is, the fragmentation of Spanish America. We sometimes wonder how many countries are there in Spanish America or South America. Depends on how you count. But you start from 2 viceroyalties to over 30 countries. And this whole process really began with the reforms, the Bourbon reforms, after the occupation of Havana. Just to underline the importance of the intendancy system is that when countries became independent, not because they all fought for independence, there is something that I call independence by default, and they had to establish new national boundaries. Guess what they did? They followed the boundaries of the intendancy. So there are many, many continuities between the Bourbon reforms and the new independent nation states. So, and that's part of the administrative reforms, but also we need to take into consideration the religious reforms. That is, Spanish America, Spain were badgered with critiques about religion, Catholicism in particular. But if you go back to the Bourbon reforms of the 1780s, with the introduction of the intendancy system, you also see a number of religious reforms. First, a little bit earlier, the expulsion of the Jesuits, okay, and then massive confiscations of the pious endowments of the church in places like Mexico in 1804, which had also tremendous consequences for what would happen after. Religious reforms add to a mix that is going to kind of make the whole empire to rethink in geopolitical terms what's the new reality is going to be. Lastly, is a response to the reforms, and that is massive rebellions. Yesterday, some of the rebellions were mentioned. The Tupac Amaru rebellion in the Andes, what is today Bolivia, Peru, devastated the Andean region from 1780 to 1783. And then we also have the Comunero rebellion in what is today Colombia. What is the significance of this? Many people have tried to, using the thesis of the age of revolutions, try to link the American Revolution to the rebellions. But it turns out that the rebellions had much more to do with kind of the administrative changes, with the taxation, okay, over basic goods, and some of the accumulated resentments, not so much against the empire, because the empire represented the law, even though it was very slow, but resentment towards the people who were on top of the pyramid in Spanish America, but who were still kind of second-class citizens in the system, okay? Accumulated resentments, which translated into the massive destruction of property, especially in the Andean areas, and which determined not the acceleration of independence, but the postponement of independence in Spanish America, because this particular Creole class that never amounted to more than a small percentage, maybe 20% of the Creole class, got absolutely scared of popular rebellions, okay? And that meant that any idea of revolution was going to have negative effects on that particular Creole class, and that is one of the reasons why they were, especially the royal officials, they were really nervous about containing the information coming from the 13 colonies basically at that time, contain the information that would encourage in some way some type of rebellion. Okay. There were a couple of smaller rebellions, like the Picornell rebellion in Venezuela in the late 1790s. And he claimed that he was inspired by the American Revolution. But there was no way to document that, absolutely not. And his followers were about, so according to Peggy Liz, 70 people, okay? So the linkage between the American Revolution and the rebellions of the 1780s really had very little relationship. And in fact, it takes some archaeological work to see that many connections. And most of the connections, as Richard Kagan is working on, were not in Spanish America, they were in Philadelphia or in Baltimore, okay? But the perception was the perception of danger, okay? The American Revolution represented more than anything a potential threat, okay? But the seeds of rebellion, they did not need a model from anywhere, okay? They were responses to the Bourbon reforms, okay? Now, in the case of perceptions of the U.S., we have very few people who came through directly from Spanish America to the United States. The great exception is Francisco de Miranda, a very, very significant person. He was in Pensacola. He also participated in the New Providence, dislodging of the British, and then proceeded to visit the United States. It was a trip of about 19 months, from 1783 to 1784. It's not exactly Tocqueville, but it's as good a primary source as you can get. You know, he went from South Carolina to Philadelphia. He claimed that it was in New York in 1784, in the spring of 1784, that he first thought about the idea of Spanish-American independence. There is a translation of the diary, and I really highly recommend it, because he was very interested, of course, in battlefields, meeting with some of the generals, some of soldiers. He was really gathering a lot of information about the war, but he was also observing a society. What is most interesting in that diary is that there you have some early impressions about democracy. The tone is rather sarcastic. You know, he tells the anecdote. He was really completely horrified that he was traveling in a stagecoach, and then when it came time to lunch, the coachman joined him at the table. He was just horrified. And he said, it was not without much exertion that I have to have my servant serve separately. Okay, so there is a certain aristocratic Creole attitude towards democracy and republicanism. Okay, this is one of the very, very early indications. Now, he met just about everybody. And at the beginning, you know, there was a great deal of enthusiasm. He was well received. It's very clear that what he praised, especially knowing Europe, that in Europe it was very difficult. You needed passports to go from one place to the other. He was impressed that he could go anywhere, New England, from South Carolina, everywhere, moving around, complete freedom. So that's an early observation. American hospitality was remarked in the diary. So just a letter of introduction would serve, you know, for him to be lionized in different cities in the United States. Now, he was a charming guy, it's no doubt about it. But one of the things that he praised about the United States was actually British institutions. So I say, well, American democracy is okay, but what's good is that it resembles more like British institutions, and that's what's good about it. So Alexander Hamilton met him, and at the beginning he was kind of charmed by the guy, but then changed his mind, and allow me to quote. He said, several years ago, this man was in America, much heated with the project of liberating South America from Spanish domination. I had frequent conversation with them on this subject, and I presume expressed ideas favorable to the object and perhaps gave an opinion that it was one to which the United States would look with interest. He went then to England upon it. Hence, his present letter, this is a letter dated February 27, 1798, and Hamilton continues, I shall not answer because I consider him as an intriguing adventurer. Okay, so he didn't make a good impression, and that's just the inauguration of a number of negative attitudes towards Spanish America. The other notable person who was in the United States a little bit later during Jefferson's government was, of course, Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar was not as systematic about collecting his notes, so all of the recollections are subsequent, and in fact, at least 10 years subsequent to his visit to the United States. So there isn't really much of a record, okay? However, of course, after the crisis, the imperial crisis, the Napoleonic invasion, you have a response in the form of several provisional governments, which interestingly enough, and in part because of the alliance between Great Britain and Spain, many of these early provisional governments called juntas, they pledge allegiance to Ferdinand VII. Okay. Now, many people claim that, many historians claim that that is a so-called mask of Ferdinand. So it's just to humor Great Britain. But it turns out that if you look at the composition of the juntas, you know, they were royalists, but they were also revolutionaries. And those revolutionaries in particular begin to look at the United States in a different way. So the questions are now asking, why is the United States doing so well? Prior to the Constitution of 1787, there were multiple state constitutions, and they travel really very fast during this time of crisis. So one of the first indications of the use of state constitution happened in New Granada. Okay, so the idea was already percolating that you know, you could actually run a country without a monarch if you have you know, a written constitution. So I dare to propose that that's the real influence of the American Revolution in Spanish America, is the adoption of early constitutionalism. In the case of New Granada, you know, we have people like Miguel de Pombo. One of the people who signed an act of federation was Manuel José Restrepo, who was really a great historian, who later changed his mind. And he changed his mind along the lines of Simón Bolívar, because he say, well, to create a federal structure, you need a lot more than signing a document. That, of course, was a leitmotif of Simón Bolívar. That is, that to follow the guidance of a constitution and to have loyalty to the constitution in the absence of the king, you have to have certain values firmly in place. First and foremost, as we see in the documents that Simón Bolívar issued, especially in the Jamaica letter and then in the Angostura address of 1819, is that you need virtue. This is following Montesquieu's classification of forms of government, in which the animating principle of republics is virtue. That, I think, brings people closer to the Republicans in the United States at Jefferson's time, and away from the federalists, okay? Of like John Adams, who, by the way, and this is really part of the misunderstanding and the misperceptions from both sides. That is, John Adams and Jefferson himself was not very, very kind to Spanish America, and this is something that we need to address. I mean, the mutual misunderstandings, you know, the kind of sarcastic comments about democracy in the United States, but on the other side, the views from the United States about Spanish America. So, you know, somebody like Thomas Jefferson would say things like, the glimmerings which reach us from South America enable us to see that its inhabitants are held under the accumulated pressure of slavery, superstition, and ignorance. That's Thomas Jefferson. Then somebody like John Adams would say things like, I don't know what happened in his trip to Paris from northern Spain. Something terrible must have happened. Because he said, this is another claim that Richard Kagan has really taught us about how South America is being seen from the prism of whatever perceptions that exist about Spain. Okay? So without ever having been in South America, but only in Spain, he would say things like, the people of South America are the most ignorant, the most bigoted, the most superstitious of all the Roman Catholics in Christendom. And then he added, democracy, no, it's impossible. They say establishing a democracy there would be as absurd as similar plans would be to establish democracies among the birds, beasts, and fishes. I mean, if you are in South America and that is the perception, my goodness, there was a lot of these misunderstandings. But practically, and we see this in the testimonies of Bolivar and many others, the real issue is that the United States had a lot on its plate, and so did Spanish America. So there was some sentiment in favor of Spanish American independence and establishing republics, but then the War of 1812 comes. If you take the example of Venezuela, and they were desperate because in 1812, the so-called Patria Boba, or the foolish republic, collapses, not only because of internal dissensions, but also because of a devastating earthquake and the opposition of the Catholic Church. So they could not hope during the War of 1812 to get any assistance from the United States. Okay? And that's why Bolivar and others decided that the only possibilities of help would come from Europe. So there are lots of missed opportunities in linking Republican nations, North and South, which made many Creoles, but especially people like Miranda and Bolivar, to look to Great Britain. Okay? On top of that, just when Ferdinand VII had been restored and who unleashed a vindictive repression of the Spanish-American revolutions, the United States was concentrating on defining the boundary treaty. It took years to discuss, which ended up being the Adams-Onís Treaty of 1819, but then it took more years to get it ratified, Okay, so the US really, on the one hand, had a certain distance from Spanish America, but it couldn't do very much even if it wanted. So the Spanish American revolutions really took double the years of the war in the United States because there was no assistance from anywhere, really. So I want to finish with a question, is what may we conclude from the reactions of the wider Hispanic world to the American Revolution? From the Spanish-American side, as distinct from monarchical Spain, there were few ongoing questions about the North American border, except for Mexico. For Spanish America, and especially South America, the issue was the extent to which the popular rebellions of the 1780s were or could be influenced by the American Revolution. Once the region became independent, clearly the most important influence was the role of the state constitutions, and later the 1787 Constitution, as a model for the mostly Republican political system. Federalism appeared to be a double-edged sword. It was certainly an alternative, but the attempts to implement it ended in disastrous civil wars, first in New Granada, Venezuela, and later Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and Central America. Federalism remained in the books, but not in practice. In many cases, and at different times, political experimentation, and we see it in the case of Bolívar, ended up being a centralist despotism. Clearly, this was not the intention of the early American Republic. Developments in the Southern Hemisphere between 1783 and 1830, these serve only marginal and not always flattering comment, but it did install a debate about the most appropriate political models to the circumstances of recently independent regions. Of course, there is an abundance of references to the United States after the period covered in this essay, but it would take us quite beyond the revolutionary era and even into the early Republic to fully assess what this relationship between North and South would actually translate into some collaboration or mutual admiration. So the American Jubilee of 1826, when the US was firmly organized and in place for the most part, we know some of the darker sides, but Spanish America in 1826, after Ayacucho, was just beginning the arduous task of trying to find the best political model for the new republics. So the US is a reference, but it's an ambiguous reference, and at least we can say that it informed the political debate for the rest of the century. Thank you for your patience, and good afternoon.
Our next speaker is this year's co-winner of the Pulitzer Prize for History. Professor Kathleen DuVal will share her work on indigenous groups in the borderlands between the United States and the Spanish Empire. Professor Kathleen DuVal is a history professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's a Guggenheim Fellow and the author of Native Nations: A Millennium in North America, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History, the Bancroft Prize, the Mark Linton History Prize, and the Candil History Prize. Her other books include Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, The Native Ground, Indians and Colonists in the Heart of the Continent, and the U.S. history textbook, Give Me Liberty. Welcome, Professor DuVal.
Thank you, and I want to add my thanks to the organizers and everybody who's been involved in bringing us here. I want to start with a map. This is a map from 1757, made by the French, but it's a map that was used through the Revolution and beyond. This coloring, this particular version of the map and the way it's colored is actually from 1780 in the middle of the Revolution. So you can see that when the map was originally made, it was made in France, and all of Louisiana was French, both sides of the Mississippi River. By the time this is colored in 1780, the 7 Years' War has happened, and Europeans have split the Mississippi Valley between Spanish Louisiana, which is yellow on this map, and then you can see Spanish Mexico and New Mexico in green here, leading off to the west. And West and East Florida, which at this point, 1780, after the 7 Years' War, is British. Those colonies are British. So, and then you can see in the words are written in French because it's a French map. But besides Louisiane, you can see Floride, Georgie, Caroline on up. But obviously, those are British colonies that by 1780 are in the midst of rebellion. But now I want to zoom in a little bit more on this map. This is a non-colored version, just to make it a little bit clearer, but it's the same map. If you remember, Louisiane, Georgie, those words are in, say, a font about this big. I know that this will only be relative, right? Just below that, in a smaller font, but with more of them, are the names of native nations. So again, they're written in French, so they may not be quite as recognizable, but you can see over to the east, the Cherokees, there are the Chickasaws here in the middle, over here the Osage, the Caddos, the Choctaws. This shows that in the 18th century, Native American nations were still very powerful, and that the people fighting in the American Revolution, whether rebels or representatives of empires or makers of maps, knew that Native nations were very powerful in the 18th century. Native nations fought in the American Revolution to protect their own independence. They might fight on one side or another side, or in some cases stay out of the war, but they made those foreign policy decisions based on what they thought would forward their own independence, specifically their national independence. So if you get only 1 point out of my talk today, it's that Native nations made decisions as nations in the American Revolution, not as part of the United States, not as part of empires, even though empires might color in the maps as if those Native nations were part of the empires. They thought of themselves, and they were independent nations. So in many ways, Native American nations worked for similar kinds of political sovereignty and national independence that the signers of the Declaration of Independence did. And for some of them, allying with the Spanish Empire was the best way, they believed, to protect their national independence. And now on the surface, that might sound ridiculous. Why would you ally with an empire to protect your national independence? But of course, that's exactly what the United States does in the American Revolution. So not that odd, perhaps. At the start of the war, most American Indians wanted to stay out of the revolution. They saw it as a squabble within an empire. And in fact, they used family metaphors at first to describe it. They would say, King George is the father, and this dispute is between the father and his children. And if you're wise, you stay out of family arguments, right? You don't get involved on one side or the other. But some Native nations, some Native Americans did end up getting involved in the American Revolution, either because they decided it was advantageous to them to be involved, or in some cases because they got drawn in against their will, because of circumstances, because of war happening on their homelands. Now I'm going to get over to Spain in just a moment, but I'm going to start in the 13 rebellious colonies, just to give you a little contrast of the kinds of situations that Native Americans found themselves in. I'm going to start in the heart of the 13 colonies. This is in sort of near the border of South Carolina and North Carolina. Some Native Americans lived right within and among colonists and found themselves right in the fighting itself. And for these, like the Catawba Nation, which I'll be talking about specifically here, it was much more common to join the revolution on the side of the rebels, join the revolution against the British crown. And they did that because that was the side of their neighbors, their white and black neighbors. They had family ties to, economic ties to, religious ties to, sometimes went to the same churches. So the Catawba Nation, for example, here on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina, the Catawbas fought alongside their Carolina neighbors to throw off the British Empire. There are other places where Native Americans lived even more among settlers, like even more among colonists, in the very towns that colonists lived in. And it was very common in those towns for individual Native American men to fight on the side of the rebellion with their local militia or to enlist in the Continental Army. So, in fact, there are Native American men there with the militias that come to the road from Concord to Boston and fight at Lexington from the very beginning of the American Revolution. There are Native militiamen there alongside their colonial neighbors, friends, and family. But what I'm mostly talking about today is the title of my talk, Indigenous Groups in the Borderlands Between the United States and the Spanish Empire. When we're talking about the Spanish Empire and Native Americans, these are the kind of Native nations we're talking about, not those that are surrounded by colonists like the Catawbas. These are independent Native nations making decisions, as I said, as nations. And they will take advantage of this war to protect their own independence, and specifically by the 1770s, to protect that independence by protecting their land from British colonists coming onto that land. So for Native nations on the border of the British colonies, the greatest enemy, the enemy that actually many of them think needs to be fought, are colonists moving west from the British colonies. So it's important to, as we think about this, to remember they are independent nations with their own territory. They aren't surrounded the way the Catawbas are. And they're on the quite dangerous border of the expanding British colonies. Now, why are the British colonies expanding on the eve of the American Revolution and thereafter? The population of the British colonies is doubling every generation. It's the fastest growing population in the world in the second half of the 18th century. And it's a nation of farmers. So say you're a colonial farmer in the British colonies. You have several sons. Life expectancy is growing. Your sons are much more likely to survive to adulthood than in a previous generation. You want each of your sons to be a landowner. And that means moving west. And that means coming into conflict with Native nations on the border. To keep the peace between these farming families, these colonial families that wanted more land, and these very powerful Native nations, the British Empire declared, in general, that no settlers were allowed to go west of the Appalachian Mountains without the permission of the Crown. This is the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763, in the Proclamation of 1763, the British administration acknowledged that west of the Appalachian Mountains, that was native land out there. That belonged to Native Americans. Now, to them it was part of the British Empire, but there were parts of the British Empire that had colonial towns in them, and there were parts of the British Empire that were native nations. Sometimes even British troops would be sent to remove settlers who illegally crossed the Appalachian Mountains into Tennessee and other places like that, which were still part of native land at that point. Now, that's a huge source of conflict between the colonists, the British colonists, and their empire sending troops to keep them off of land that they think that they should have, and the fact that they think they won from France in the 7 Years' War. So, thinking about these native nations on the border, on this dangerous border with the British colonists, their natural choice in this coming war, if they had to fight on one side or the other, if they were going to fight on one side or the other, would be with the British, would be with the British crown, that at least in theory is protecting their land, and against these rebels, among whom are people who want Western land. The British understood this incentive, and the British very much expected that strong native nations would fight on their side and help them put down this rebellion. Now, Bernardo de Galvez also knew this incentive, that the incentive of strong native nations on the border of the British colonies would be to fight on the British side. And he's going to work to change their mind. But let me introduce you first to two different native nations, both of which start out as allies of the British, but by the end of the war will move and will eventually end up as Spanish allies. The Muskogee Creek Confederacy first, including a man named Alexander McGillivray. And I'll also introduce you to the Chickasaw Nation and a man named Payamataha. So first, the Muskogee Creek Confederacy. The Muskogee Creeks at the time in the 18th century were on the border, basically, on both sides of the border of what's now Alabama and Mississippi. They were a confederacy, so they were spread into many, many towns, many more towns than are on this map, but this just gives you an idea of basically where their towns were, and in two general clusters, the Upper Creeks and the Lower Creeks. That also meant they were on the border of Spanish Louisiana and British West Florida. The Muskogee Creeks in the 18th century were very powerful. They probably had about 10,000 people on the eve of the American Revolution. And indeed, they were wary of settlers coming onto their land, so they had that incentive that the British knew they did. But many of them wanted to stay out of the war. Let the British and their colonists fight it out. And even to those Creeks who wanted to use the war to fight against settlers, British strategy didn't appeal to them. So let me explain that to you. Britain needed the Creeks and other strong native nations on their side, but what they wanted to do was just use Creek warriors as soldiers, so still sort of similar to the Hessians. Like, get Creek warriors to join up and go where British officers told them to go. Go to the battles, fight in the battles where they were told to do. And remember, Britain is fighting a revolution. They don't want for native warriors to anger the people who might eventually come back in the British fold. There are two ways to put down a revolution. One is to beat the people into the ground. That's not what the British are trying to do in the American Revolution. The other is to try to bring the people back into the fold. And so British officials were worried if native warriors attacked and killed and scalped and captured colonists, that might actually make colonists less likely to give up this silly revolution and come back to the British Empire. On the other hand, Muskogee Creeks, who wanted to fight, wanted to put their effort directly into attacking settlements that they saw as illegal, colonists who had moved west toward or even on to Muskogee Creek land. As one Muskogee Creek leader put it in 1776, "I have sat quietly a long time now without joining either party, but the Virginians are now come very near my nation, and I do not want them to come any nearer." Right? We got to stop this now. So many Muskogee Creeks wanted to fight, but they also believed it was Britain's job to bring its colonists under control, to patrol the proclamation line. Basically, the Muskogee Creeks were willing to join the fighting as long as they could fight in their own way. And that's what they did. They attacked and they pushed back illegal settlers off of their land. Now, some Muskogee Creeks were willing to join big British engagements and to be under the sort of tactics and strategies of British officials if they were fighting, say, in Virginia or in Georgia. But as it turned out, when the British called the Muskogee Creeks to fight for them, it was on the Gulf Coast, and it was against Spain. And many of the Muskogee Creeks were like, wait, Spain is not our enemy here. That is actually not, that doesn't follow our war objectives to fight against Spain, to make an enemy out of the Spanish Empire. A major advocate among the Creeks, and there are big debates going on among the Creeks about whether to join this war or not, a major advocate for fighting against the settlers, against the colonists on the side of the British, was a man named Alexander MacGillivray. Now, he sounds Scottish, right? And his father was Scottish. But his mother was Muskogee Creek. And the Muskogee Creeks are matrilineal. And so, despite his name, Alexander MacGillivray was every bit as much Creek as he was Scottish. He was the son of a Scottish trader. He was born in Muskogee Creek country. But when he was about 6, his father took him to Charleston so he could sort of learn both sides of the fur trading business. But as the rebellion heated up, his Scottish father, ended up being a loyalist and was expelled from the colonies. And so he and his sister, who was also with him in the East, got on their horses and rode back to Muskogee Creek country. And Alexander MacGillivray arrived back home very much wanting to defeat the colonists, to join with the British. He says to other Muskogee Creeks, we should fight. We should take advantage of this war to put down the colonists. In the spring of 1780, Alexander MacGillivray was trying to raise a war party to go against Georgia, to fight against Georgia, when he received urgent news from West Florida's commanding general, John Campbell, that the Spanish had attacked Mobile. General Campbell wrote to MacGillivray and said, come to Mobile, the Spanish have attacked. Come as soon as you can with as many warriors as you could collect. Now, MacGillivray knew that most Muskogee Creeks didn't particularly want to fight the Spanish, but he convinced a lot of them by talking about the bigger war aims. We have to fight on the side of the British in this fight. And he also talked about how much individual glory they could get by fighting in this battle. And it worked. MacGillivray rode toward Mobile with 600 Muskogee Creek warriors, and there was another maybe about that many getting ready to ride behind him, and also to the defense of Mobile. But when the Muskogee Creeks and a few Choctaws as well arrived in West Florida, Mobile had already fallen to Bernardo de Galvez. So picture this. MacGillivray arrives, he comes with Choctaws as well as Creeks. They expect General Campbell to invite him into Pensacola, where Campbell is at this point, and thank them for coming, give them a big feast to encourage them to come the next time the Spanish attack, because everybody knows the Spanish are going to eventually attack Pensacola. Instead, Campbell, who's very upset at having lost Mobile, Campbell sends word to MacGillivray that he's sick. They don't get hosted at all in Pensacola. The warriors return home to Muskogee Creek country, disgusted with the British. The British are incompetent, they're rude. Maybe we should rethink this whole thing. I'll come back to the Muskogee Creeks in a moment, but I want to bring in the Chickasaws here, because their story has some parallels, but also some differences. The Chickasaw Nation was at the time centered north and west of where the Creek Confederacy was, in what's now western Tennessee and northern Mississippi. The Chickasaw population was smaller than that of the Creeks, but they were very powerful. In fact, the Chickasaws had been the military power of the previous century in this whole region. And the Chickasaws were tightly allied with Britain. The Chickasaws had fought on the same side as Britain against France, and the Chickasaws had fought against almost every other native nation in the region. They had a fearsome reputation. The French, several times during the epoch of French Louisiana, tried to defeat the Chickasaws and failed. But at the end of the 7 Years' War, France leaves. France surrenders its claim to the center of the continent. And a Chickasaw leader who had been a warrior in these wars that had happened before, but by this point is a warrior, by this point is a diplomatic leader, a man named Payamataha. He saw opportunity in the French leaving, and he really changed Chickasaw history in the 1760s and 1770s. When the French left, Payamataha saw the opportunity to make peace, to change the course of Chickasaw history, to stop losing people to the violence that had been a generation or two. They made peace with other Native nations in the region, nations that they'd been fighting against for decades. They made a new peace with Spain, so Spain is new to their region. They forged good relationships with the Spanish, and the idea was also to keep good relations with Britain, not to burn any bridges, to build peace with everybody. Payamataha held huge peacemaking councils all around the region, and all of this was going very, very well for the Chickasaws and peace, until the Revolutionary War broke out. And suddenly, the British expected the Chickasaws to fight for the British. Throughout the war, over and over, the Chickasaws get calls like those that we just heard about Campbell sending to the Creeks, saying, "Come fight in this battle with us." And Payamataha would make excuses. He'd say, "Okay, we're coming," and maybe he and a couple of men would come, but never the large numbers of powerful warriors that the British knew that the Chickasaws had. He wanted to keep the peace. So, by the end of 1780, after the Spanish victory at Mobile, we have the Chickasaws who've been trying to keep the peace, trying not to get drawn into this war, and we have the Muskogee Creeks who are frustrated with the British and more reluctant than in the past to fight on their side. The Chickasaws, the Muskogee Creeks, and some Choctaws as well sent word to Bernardo de Galvez that they were considering severing ties with the British and making an alliance with Spain. They sent delegations to Mobile, now under Spanish control, and also to New Orleans to conduct diplomacy and receive supplies and be feasted in the kinds of ways that they had expected General Campbell to feast them. Now, this doesn't mean what they said to Galvez, that they were switching sides from the British to the Spanish. It really just means they are moving a little away from the British and that they're less likely to fight on the British side because they're also allying with the Spanish. As a result of the British inability to be a good ally and Spanish skillful diplomacy, when Galvez attacked Pensacola in May of 1781, McGillivray was able to persuade only about 40 Muskogee Creeks to ride with him to Pensacola's defense. Remember, it had been 600 and more coming. This time only 40, and they still get there pretty late. Muskogee Creeks, Choctaws, and Chickasaws by 1781 don't see aiding the British as really in their interest. Now, it's possible that if they had, if the Creeks and the Choctaws and the Chickasaws had, and all the other Native nations who might have joined the British side had completely, wholeheartedly fought for the British, the revolution would have had a harder time succeeding. But that was not what they were going to do. They were looking out for their own interests, for their own independence. Now, as we know, the British soon gave up, soon after that battle, the Battle of Pensacola, gave up, cut their losses. At the Treaty of Paris in 1783, as you know, it was signed by Britain and the United States alone. On paper, the United States gained a vast empire, including west of the Appalachians, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. But on the ground, Native nations, and also the Spanish and the British, still controlled that land. So this is a map colored in according to sort of Spanish ideas of what the Treaty of Paris meant. Quite different from those you saw earlier of what the United States thinks. The lines are created by the Treaty of Paris, or what Britain thinks. To Spain, at least briefly, the Spanish Empire has expanded dramatically, and all of that pink, back to what it says Florida there now, but back to what Louisiana looked like before the 7 Years' War, when it was all French. Now all of that to the Spanish on both sides of the Mississippi River belongs to Spain. and only that green part is the United States. Only that green part, still all east of the Appalachian Mountains. When Alexander MacGillivray received the news that Britain and the United States had made a separate peace, he couldn't believe it. He wrote, "Britain has no right to give up a country she could never call her own." He said, "The Muskogee Creeks were not at the treaty. We weren't invited to Paris. We didn't surrender our land, and we were winning. Like, we weren't actually losing this war. We wouldn't have surrendered." So, Alexander MacGillivray and other Native leaders in the region seek a formal alliance with Spain. MacGillivray wrote to Louisiana Governor Esteban Miro, in the Louisiana side, and wrote also to West Florida governor, the new governor of West Florida, Arturo O'Neill. He's a wild goose, so he's one of the Irishmen serving the Spanish Empire. So these are both Spanish colonies, Louisiana and West Florida. And writes to them, MacGillivray says to them, "The Muskogee Creeks are turning to Spain now because we have been most shamefully deserted by the British." And he wrote, "We want an alliance with Spain and the protection of a great monarch." In 1784, Louisiana Governor Miro invited the Muskogee Creeks to Pensacola, and he invited the Chickasaws and the Choctaws to Mobile. These are for two different diplomatic meetings, to discuss a grand alliance, as Miro wrote, on which the permanent tranquility of these provinces depends. Large numbers at both places of men, women, and children witnessed this treaty making. Both Creek and Chickasaw and Choctaw tradition, the whole population is supposed to be there to ratify a treaty at this level. The signed agreement, which was signed by Miro and O'Neill, as well as the Native leaders, the signed agreement said that this is the Creek one specifically, "The free nation of Muskogee Creeks expect His Majesty to protect them against the intentions of those who believe they have a sovereign right in the villages." So that's sort of twisted, but it means like the United States claims they have the right to our villages. Spain is actually going to protect our real right to them. The Spanish negotiators pledged, "The generous mind of His Most Catholic Majesty is far from exacting lands from Indians." Right? The king knows these lands are yours. In the treaty, it says, "The Creek Confederacy is the proprietor, and the king simply seeks to secure and guarantee to them those lands which they actually hold according to the right by which they possess them." The treaties at Mobile with the Chickasaws and the Choctaws are similar to that one. And it worked for a while. The United States agreed to peace and treaty lines that were more generous than this with the Creeks in 1790 and also with the Chickasaws and Choctaws. Now, we know there will be great losses to these nations, these native nations, in the coming years. Spain would give up its claims over Alabama, Mississippi, eventually over Louisiana. The United States will eventually forcibly remove the Creeks and the Chickasaws and the Choctaws to Indian territory. But I think it's really important just to pause here for a moment and note how truly diplomatic these relationships were between the Spanish Empire on the one hand and what they clearly recognize as native nations, sovereign nations, on the other. So with that in mind, I just want to close with a picture of just down the street, the National Museum of the American Indian, because I think this kind of history, this history of alliances, including with the Spanish, shows in part how Native nations survived as independent sovereign nations and remained the Muskogee Creeks and the Catawbas and the Chickasaws and more than 600 federally and state recognized tribes in the United States today.
So our last speaker tonight is Professor Jane Landers, who will present Afro-Americans in the Borderlands between the United States and the Spanish Empire. Professor Jane Landers is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of History and Director of the Slave Society's Digital Archive at Vanderbilt University. Since 2015, she has served as the United States member on UNESCO's International Scientific Committee for the Roots of Enslaved Peoples. Her award-winning monographs include Black Society in Spanish Florida and Atlantic Creoles in the Age of Revolutions. And she's the co-author or editor of 5 other books and numerous articles and book chapters on the history of Africans in the Atlantic world. Her work with National and State Park Service projects has uncovered Africans in the early Spanish explorations of North America and Formosus, the first free Black town in what is today the United States. Professor Landers, we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you, Begonia, for the nice intro. It's a great honor to be here with you today and to participate in this second academic symposium, America and Spain. And I would like to thank our hosts, the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, the Fundación Ramón Areces, and the Daughters of the American Revolution for hosting us. So I'm going to take us back in time a little bit longer even than some of our others, because Spain ruled the whole southern borderlands of our country for several hundred years prior to the creation of the United States. And yet, due to the linguistic barriers, much of that history is less well known than that of the English colonies that were established much later, as Richard Kagan pointed out. So much of my own career has been devoted to researching that earlier Hispanic history of our country, and we're lucky to have the wonderful Archive of the Indies, Archivo General de Indias, where all of us have to go and do this early research. This history is focusing today, I'm speaking about the Black subjects who are in these archives, who helped Spain hold La Florida for Spain. As first imagined, La Florida encompassed a vast territory stretching from the Florida Keys to Newfoundland and west to the, quote, mines of Mexico. At least that was the imagined claim of the Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de León, who came from Puerto Rico to examine and explore the United States in 1513, what became the United States in 1513. Here are some of the other expeditions that explored the whole south borderlands of the United States. And eventually then we get an exhibit that came from, or an artwork that came from the indigenous people of New Spain, what came to be New Spain in the Mexico explorations of Ponce de León, Juan Garrido, one of the most well-known and documented of the earlier explorers, because he was a literate man who left an account of his explorations all the way through Florida, through Mexico, west to California, looking for black Amazons, they said, and eventually settles in Mexico. So he leaves us quite a commentary on his life, and so did the indigenous people who made art about him. And then we had the first Spanish attempt at a colony in what became the United States, and it was Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, who came up from what is today the Dominican Republic, right after a Spanish slave revolt that I'm talking about in another book, and he made this exploration also and an attempt at colonization that failed in 1526. But it was the famed Spanish admiral, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, who finally in 1565 established the first permanent European settlement in what is today the United States, which is St. Augustine, Florida. In St. Augustine, Spanish settlers established a two-tier system of African slavery, also found in other Spanish colonies. Unacculturated and recently introduced Africans called bozales did hard labor on government fortifications and other public works. But Spanish-speaking Catholic slaves known as Ladinos, such as some of the characters that we found in the archives, that I found in the archives, and then that we put in an exhibition at St. Augustine, they carried on a wide range of urban, domestic, artisanal, and lower status economic roles, working in occupations as varied as tailoring to masonry. And so this is Juanillo, who survived a Spanish shipwreck and lived for 8 years among the Calusa Indians before Pedro Menéndez de Áviles found him and rescued him back to Catholicism, as they would have said. We also have a mixed race, very important person in the Spanish Black militia, who also organized a store in St. Augustine, again, literate, and left records for us. And here's someone who was a convict from Cuba who was exiled to Spanish Florida to serve his sentence. He had very important skills as an artisan, as an iron worker, and he ends up working for the military and fixing all their weaponry, and has finally finished his sentence and becomes free and has his own shop. And then we even find women of African descent in these records because in the Spanish system, they could be property owners and they could also go to court. And she, Isabel, sold little pastries in the community and went to court to talk about a settlement that someone owed her money for not paying bills. So we get many of these beautiful records that you would never get in an English system. In St. Augustine, as in Havana and other circum-Caribbean cities, slaves were also allowed to to work for themselves on Sundays and feast days, hire themselves out for an agreed-upon settlement or return to the owner. And with all that effort, slaves could accumulate sufficient income to buy their freedom or that of their kin through a Spanish legal mechanism called coartación. Owners in the state could also free the enslaved, and African freedom and enslavement existed in all the Spanish colonies, including the southern tier of what's today the United States. But the Lower South took on a different profile in 1670 when, more than a century after Spanish settlement began in the region, Barbadian planters, already hostile to Spain, established an English colony in what became Carolina, but 10 days' journey from St. Augustine. The slave codes of English planters that were developed in Barbados and transplanted to the new English colony of Carolina, they considered slaves as chattel or movable property, not unlike cattle or furniture. The English slave system featured harsh regulatory codes and minimal protections for the enslaved, and it strongly discouraged manumissions that were so common in the Spanish world. Spanish slavery, on the other hand, was based on Roman law, such as the Siete Partidas, the legal code governing all Spain's American colonies. And that code considered slavery a mutable legal condition, not a racial one. And it governed everywhere, so including in the southern tier of our country. Slaves of any race were always considered human, and as such, they were entitled to legal protections, church membership, and freedom versus testament, self-purchase, state or private manumission. And the enslaved were quick to learn the difference in the Spanish and the English slave regimes. And as Kathleen said, they knew their best options, and they went with their best options. So in 1687, Florida's governor, Diego de Quiroga, reported to Spain that 8 men, 2 women, and a nursing baby had escaped from Carolina to St. Augustine in a stolen canoe, and that they were requesting baptism into the, quote, true faith. And the slaves' telegraph, as we call it, must have quickly reported the outcomes of their escape, for Spanish officials recorded new groups of runaways being received in St. Augustine in 1688, 1689, and 1690. Unsure about how to handle the refugees, St. Augustine's officials repeatedly solicited Spain for some guidance, and finally, on November 7th, 1693, Charles II issued a royal proclamation, quote, giving liberty to all, the men as well as the women, so that by their example and by my liberality, others will do the same. And so the initiative and determination of 8 enslaved African men and their wives and 1 baby who risked their lives to become free generated a Spanish policy that would come to shape the geopolitics of the southeastern borderlands for years to come. Over the next decades, Carolina slaves continued to flee to Florida. They would see this great big stone fortress that defended the communities at Castillo de San Marcos, if you get to see it in St. Augustine today. And they would have to report to the governor's house, which is also still there in St. Augustine, is now a museum, to tell their story and make their request for sanctuary. So these kept coming and coming and coming. We have our cedula now, and we know we are supposed to free them. And so more keep coming. And some of the runaway slaves were seasoned warriors who in 1750 fought with the Yamasee Indians in their war against the English, and some may have been warriors in their own homelands. They became effective additions to the black militias that Spanish officials first established in St. Augustine in 1683, and they joined in Spanish raids against their former masters. So they also they were cowboys on the frontier. They got land through this cedula. They raised their families. They raised other animals as well, but very important contributions to the community as well as the military ones. So finally, Governor Antonio de Benavides was very enthusiastic about the military aspects of their skills, and pretty soon he establishes an attack system that goes north instead of running south. English captives in St. Augustine reported in 1727 that Benavides sent a party of 4 Yamasees and Africans northward and offered them 30 pieces of 8 for every English scalp and 100 pieces for every live Negro they brought back to St. Augustine. 6 years later, Governor Benavides advocated sending the runaways north again, this time to foment rebellion in Carolina, and he wanted to pay them for English scalps, but Spain's Council of the Indies rejected this plan. But more and more slaves kept coming southward in what I've termed a religious sanctuary policy. And finally, Florida's governor, Manuel de Montiano, who was expecting a war with England at any moment, followed a model that had already been used to pacify maroon communities in Panama, Mexico, Española, and Colombia. He established the freedom seekers in a town of their own, Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, on the northern frontier of St. Augustine. And there's a map that will show you the walled city of St. Augustine, a number of Indian mission villages right outside that wall, and on the northernmost frontier, where the English would be expected to attack, they established the town that I write about. So he established the town, and then the Crown reviewed and approved all of his actions. And they ordered that not only the blacks who had already come from Carolina, quote, but all those who in the future come as fugitives from the English colonies should be given prompt and full liberty in the name of the king. And further, the Crown ordered that so there be no further pretext for selling them, the royal edict should be publicly posted all around so that no one could claim ignorance of that ruling. The leader of the new town of Mose, as it came to be called, was a Mandinga man, possibly once a Muslim, who came from Senegal, and upon his conversion had been enslaved by the English in Carolina, ran with the Yamasee southward, and had finally been freed by this royal proclamation. When he was baptized as a Catholic, he became known as Francisco Menendez. The other freed Africans at Mose included people from Calabar, the Congo, and Angola, among others, making Mose a polyglot and very diverse community. Whatever their origins, because the residents had sworn, quote, to shed their last drop of blood in defense of Spain and the true faith, and they had converted to Catholicism, they were considered loyal vassals and free subjects. And as Spain's free black subjects all around the Caribbean also did, they formed themselves into a militia, and the frontier militia was commanded by Captain Francisco Menendez, and they and their families became homesteaders on Spain's northern frontiers. Over the next decades, the people of Mose adapted to Spanish religious and cultural expectations, and they battled English invaders and Indian raiders to defend their hard-won gains. And this is an image from the so-called War of Jenkins' Ear, when General James Oglethorpe of Georgia invaded Florida in 1740 and attacked the settlement. Despite their best efforts, Mose did not survive Oglethorpe's attacks. This is an image the Park Service made of one of the attacks. They called it the War, or the Battle of Bloody Mose. But in the hard-won settlement, the fort was ruined and the town had to be abandoned. The literate Captain Francisco Menendez subsequently wrote the King of Spain in a document form they call Servicios y Méritos, or Méritos y Servicios, telling them exactly how he had helped defend the colony in the Battle of Bloody Mose. And he was asking for his appropriate rewards for military service, just as Juan Garrido had done when he lived in Mexico in 1520s. So this is a long tradition, and we find a lot of these records that tell exactly about the actions of the black subjects in military support of Spain's empire. The governor, Manuel de Montiano, also wrote cover letters supporting Menendez's petition and request for reward. But failing to get there's Menendez's petition. He is literate, as I said, as was Juan Garrido several centuries earlier, and this was something that's not uncommon, but would be very uncommon in British colonies of the same time period. But no answer came from the king. He was a little busy with war around the whole Atlantic. And so Menendez, instead of staying in St. Augustine, became a corsair, he said, hoping to get to Old Spain to present his case to the king in person. Menendez enlisted with a celebrated Cuban-based corsair who had been the one, Fandino, to sever Jenkins' ear. And after several expeditions successfully up to the Atlantic coast as far as Ocracoke to bring back supplies to St. Augustine, he was finally captured. And he had helped rescue St. Augustine. He'd helped brought back all these wonderful supplies that we heard about from our earlier talks, too, about necessary supplies for defense. And now he had been a corsair, and now he had been captured. He was captured by an Englishman, an English ship, and was tortured and judged as a prize of war in the Bahamas. They did not recognize him as a corsair, a so-called legitimate pirate serving Spain, and they based that judgment on his skin color. So placing Menendez on the block to sell in Bahamas, his English captors called him Don Blas, to insult Spain's famed admiral Blas de Lezo, about whom our colleague Gonzalo has written a wonderful biography. Other of Spain's free black corsairs faced similar fates in New York. When in the Admiralty Court records there, we can find how they have been judged as just enslaved people in violation of their real legitimate service for Spain. And the governors of Cuba and other places searched for records to document their freedom, but to little avail. Only a few of them ever were returned to their free status in the Spanish colonies. And remarking that Spain could not man its navies without sailors of, quote, broken color, Florida's governor also went to great lengths to provide the British Admiralty courts with legal proof of the black corsairs' freedoms. But as I said, few ever got out. This may have been what happened with Francisco Menendez, because by 1759, he starts appearing again in St. Augustine's records as the leader of a second settlement created at Fort Mose, where the first one had been destroyed. And this is an artist rendering, but we got together with the historian of the Castillo de San Marcos, engineers and architects and archaeologists, and my history. We all put it together. It's about what it looked like in the second Spanish settlement there. And so I'm currently tracking our fascinating character, Francisco Menendez, through both Spanish and English archives to try to find the missing pieces of his life as I write a biography. Due to the contrasting legal systems, the Spanish archives are much richer, as Richard pointed out, than the English for tracking these people, but I hope to keep finding them. Another source that has been very well researched or has offered me a lot of wonderful clues are the Catholic Church records. They yield detailed records for all of the Spain's black subjects across North America borderlands and across the entire Spanish Empire. I first worked in these, that was a little bit early yet. I first worked in these rich records in Cuba, tracking Floridians who had emigrated there after the colony's cession to the English in 1762. And I've worked there now for over 20 years in the records, both in Cuba, in Spanish St. Augustine, and in Spain, and others around, as I'll show. With some generous funding, I've been able to also try to preserve some of these records. And the research that I was able to do in these archives eventually helped support the archaeological work that has been done in Spanish Florida by my mentor and professor, Dr. Kathleen Deegan, the blonde lady here. It was Representative Bill Clark of the Florida legislature, the Black Caucus of the Florida legislature, that got us the money, that sent me to Spain, that let me do the research, that supported then the archaeology. And after that, we did a really wonderful little book exhibit of all the artifacts that were found there and the documents that I was able to find as well, with another colleague, Darcy McMahon, who worked at the Florida Museum of Natural History. But you'll see some Haitian grad students of Kathy's. She did all the original work for National Geographic on the Columbus sites in the Caribbean. She was my mentor, and we're still friends. I stay with her when I go to St. Augustine, and we go looking for more stuff. And these are some of the objects that we found at the Mose site. It was a place that was poor and under duress, constantly under attack, so it doesn't offer a lot. And as you know, only objects like bone and glass and metal survive usually over the years. But here you can see some of the things like a variety of pipes, of pottery, of bone materials that made buttons, and weapons and bullets and so on. That material does survive. Oops. And one of the most fascinating ones that we found was this St. Christopher's medal, which someone had made at the site and was wearing. And St. Christopher is carrying Jesus over the waters on his shoulders as these people were transported across on the Middle Passage also. But also, St. Christopher is the patron saint, or was the patron saint of La Habana. And so my black militiamen, who also become corsairs, are back and forth often between St. Augustine and Havana. And again, they are geopolitical actors in all of these conflicts, as Kathleen's work shows, and others as well. They are not just chattel. Oh, and on the other side is the compass rose, which also shows you they were mariners and used to traveling the waters. Sorry. Eventually, we also created a museum exhibit at the Florida Museum of Natural History. And once it had an exhibit in Florida, it circled the country and millions of people saw it. And when it came back, we donated it to a local historical group, the Fort Mose Historical Society. And they're the wonderful folks that I've been working with since I also was a grad student way back when. And it was established in 1995. They're still very active, doing reenactments and putting on exhibits about how everybody lived on the frontier. And as I said, reenactors, the gentleman on the left, Jim Bullock, was the one who played Menendez, but we have all kinds of young folks coming in to do these shows as well. And eventually, Jeb Bush, who was governor at the time, helped get this recognized as a National Historic Landmark. So did Kathy. And he inaugurated the site with a new visitor center there. And there it is, and I hope if you get to St. Augustine, you'll be able to visit it. It's got all kinds of exhibits inside from things that we found, and a little video, and outside the reenactors are reproducing battles and doing all the interesting things that they would like to present. Now it has also been recognized by the state, and all the signage is up there so that people can find it. And then Henry Louis Gates, Skip, came down and did a whole thing about Mosey and St. Augustine, trying to, again, remedy the idea that people don't know about the Spanish history of our country. And it was in an award-winning PBS documentary called Many Rivers to Cross. And then finally, because I am working with UNESCO, I was able to nominate it and document it as a site of memory, it's called. And that means this place will never get developed into a condo somewhere in Florida. It is protected multiple ways now. It's on the National Park Service Underground Railroad South. It's on UNESCO. It's on National Historic Landmark. So thank you so much. I mean, you all are in the same effort, so thank you so much. And most recently, Governor DeSantis actually gave the National Park Service some money to recreate a little fort at the site, because, the kids love that kind of stuff too. And so we recently had an inaugural opening for a new fort now that's in there, and we had to do the research for what kind of materials would have been in there, and to approve what kind of, bedrolls and what kind of weaponry and what kind of barrels and everything else that would be inside. So we've tried to keep it real and do the research that's required. And I just mentioned that the Catholic Church records have been one of my best sources, because welcoming people into the faith, all of the sacraments are recorded from the moment they're baptized, confirmed, married, buried. Their Black religious brotherhoods are all in there. And so my old mentors introduced me to those church records in Cuba and Menorca and other places, and then I take now my students to try to preserve these old records. The oldest we have for St. Augustine are from the 1590s, and they are including all the Europeans, the indigenous people, and the Africans. And for my purposes, what's really wonderful about the African recording, and also the indigenous that Kathleen would appreciate, is very specific information about language groups and ethnonyms, they call it, about where people came from, to make sure that you don't homogenize. You would never say Europe is everything from, Finland to Italy all the same. Well, neither was Africa, and so we need to know specific information about where the people came from. And so now, this project I started way back when, we have up online free for everybody else to use, and we've focused on places, first Florida, because it was where I got my degree, and it's 1590, 16th century forward. We took it up to the end of slavery, or sometimes beyond, and now the most African places that we have gone: Cuba, Brazil, Colombia. We recently have Mexico added. Recently have, and also I go to African countries if I can get in and get to the records. So we have some from Benin, from Cabo Verde, and projects that students have done and transcriptions they've done. So I hope you can make use of it for either Spanish, Indian, or African backgrounds. And again, these are some of the great churches in St. Augustine and in Cuba, which are closely linked because of those emigrations and returns in 1784 to 1821. It was the second Spanish period, they call it. We have all those as well. And that's our team in St. Augustine documenting those records. My former student, Pablo Gomez, who's a Colombian orthopedic surgeon who came back to school to get his history degree and has written a wonderful book called Experiential Caribbean. He was part of that team. And then, as I said, or as you heard earlier from earlier talks, in 1763, the community of Mose and all the indigenous mission villages and the Spaniards emigrated to Cuba through the treaty requirements. And so we track them now. Also, we return to Cuba. We're the only ones that have been able to get in to the Cuban records through my earlier connections with the Catholic Church. And some of the military records we get out of the secular records, they're very important too, and imagery like this is actually from the Archivo General de Indias, but to show you the status of Africans in the communities that we study. And these are some of the baptismal records that we got from Cuba originally. You find actually some fun artwork sometimes in them as well that you can use for evidence. Oops, shoot, I went backwards. But again, we went back not too long ago to where those people were resettled after they left Florida. It was called San Agustín de la Nueva Florida, St. Augustine of the New Florida, but today everybody in Cuba calls it Ceiba Mocha. It's a little remote town in the Matanzas province, but because, again, I went there, you know, when I was just a grad student, I'm walking down the street and somebody said, "Janie," and it was a doctor that I met like when I was, you know, unreal to see that. But this is what the rest of the records look like, and it's a race against time to try to save them when we can't conserve them when we're doing these runs. It's short term and fast, but we take records as much as we can. And this was the church we went back to in Ceiba Mocha, and PBS came and did a little bit of a thing there with us as well. And these are all the funders that I owe all this work to, who have given us money over the years to do this kind of work. And I'm very, very, very grateful. And we make it available freely to everybody online. I train students in all these countries. I get money for the equipment. We go train them. We leave the equipment. We make inventories of everything, and we give them copies of everything. So it's not an extractive, you know, process. It's to share it with everybody, because we're spoiled, we have money, we have grants, but most of those countries don't. And just some things that I've been working for all these years to try to get the black subjects of Spain into the southern borderlands, and with edited things and other things. And the new the new Fort Mose book has just come out, so we're trying to help promote it still, and I hope you'll get to St. Augustine and see it someday. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for some questions. Professor Landers, one member of the audience would like to know, you mentioned military rewards. Did Spain have a pension system for wives and widows? Were there rewards like pensions?
Actually, if somebody's husband dies, the widow could write, and they present themselves as miserable people, you know, and that it needs the beneficent, support of the king. And they would get land grants, they would get other things, and they would also write the histories of their deceased husbands to request that.
Excuse me, we're getting. Professor DuVal, somebody would like to know, was it common for Spaniards and Creoles to marry indigenous Americans in the 18th century? And if that was the case, did that connection influence Spanish involvement in the US Revolution?
That's a great question. And no, not really. When the Spanish came and took over what had been French Louisiana, they didn't have that many people to send. And so there are just very few actual Spaniards or even people from the Spanish Empire in Louisiana and West Florida, just really mostly the very top officials. There isn't a large immigration of, say, Spanish traders the way you might see in other parts of the Spanish Empire, and that was definitely true of French traders earlier, when French Louisiana just had more time and attracted more, relatively more French colonists. So I think there are many parts of the history of the Spanish Empire where what you asked would be exactly true. It just happens that in the case of Louisiana and West Florida in the American Revolution, it's not true just because of the low number of Spaniards there and the reasons for these alliances and in the American Revolution, just it really is, as Dr. Quintaro said yesterday, it's just realpolitik. It's about who good allies might be.
Actually, that was a twofold question. The same person wanted to know, when you mentioned that the population increased during the second half of the 18th century, in the colonies, and that was the fastest growing population globally. Did this growth include enslaved and indigenous people?
It definitely includes, when those population figures include enslaved people, and that population is also growing very fast for different reasons, right? There is a large Atlantic slave trade at this point into the British colonies, as well as natural increase, right, as demographers call it, babies surviving to become adults. And it counts some indigenous people because they are, because they live within the colonies, but it doesn't count any of the indigenous people still living in their own nations. And that's the way sort of population counts will go in the early United States as well. It counts enslaved people, counts indigenous, the fairly small numbers of indigenous people who live within the colonies, and doesn't count the people in native nations. But yeah, the enslaved population is growing as well. Okay, good point.
Professor Jaksic, somebody would like to know, what is the next research question related to the view of U.S. independence in Latin America that you think should be studied and presented to U.S. audiences?
Thank you. Well, I think republicanism has been investigated. But I think confronting ideas about American republicanism, Spanish American republicanism, I think may enrich our intellectual history and actually the history of political thought. Unfortunately, we have not developed among our students the skills to combine history and political theory, but I think it offers great opportunities to develop commonalities and build on those commonalities if we try to see the different expressions of republicanism.
Professor Landers, somebody wrote, the numbers of Spanish importation of enslaved people into Central and South America in the 1500s and 1600s was incredibly high, much higher compared to North America. Were Spanish enslaved persons always allowed to purchase their own freedom? And was this across all the Spanish-controlled areas? And why was the Spanish view on enslaved people different from that of the British counterparts?
Well, actually, the big slave trade is the English slave trade of the 18th century. But there was always slavery in the Spanish world, and there were always free people. And the enslaved could include Spaniards who had committed a crime. I had a Spanish man who was committed to perpetual slavery for the murder of his wife. And as an American, I was reading this and I thought, well, they will not make him really a slave, will they? Yes. 10 years later, he's still working on the walls of Havana, Cuba, next to the Congo imported slaves, So it is a system that had, in a galley slave ship that I found outside St. Augustine, had Turks, had Moroccans, had Germans or Flemish, had Spanish, only 2 people of African descent on that whole galley. So it used to be that anyone could become an enslaved person, and also they could work their way out of it. As the English start developing sugar plantations all through the Caribbean, that model doesn't like that open system and tries to shut it down. And so eventually that will get harder and harder. The English have the one-drop system. You're a slave forever, and your children will be also follow the mother's condition. Totally different.
Okay, and I think we'll take one more question, again for you, Professor Landers. Can you please speak a little bit about the role of enslaved and free blacks in Galvez's various military pursuits? The role of enslaved and free blacks in Galvez's military pursuits, or anybody who... in the army... In Galvez, in Bernardo de Galvez.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I didn't. Yes, well, everybody has already talked in this conference and last conference, too, about Galvez and his role in Pensacola. I really stay more in the East Florida, but the Cuban groups that come up are some of those that I study as well. And so black militias are everywhere, and all the way up to where we're talking with Dr. Jaksic about in the new wars of the American independence, and then the revolutions of Latin America, black militia, black participation, always, everywhere.
Yeah, Galvez has free black troops, he has enslaved black troops coming from New Orleans, coming from Cuba, and coming from many other places, yeah.
And emancipation was offered to soldiers who joined the liberation armies across the Andes, and as well as in North and South America. So there was a significant liberation because of the wars of independence.
And if we carry it forward a little bit, Andy Jackson even offered friendship to his free black friends, you know, to join with him. And then ironically, you know, he deals somewhat with the Spaniards, but will not really want free black militias on the frontier anymore after that. And Thomas Jefferson, that we've mentioned several times now, actually is the person as Secretary of State who shuts down the religious sanctuary policy in 1790. And so we begin to see, you know, Spain is losing power, and with it, so do the black militias.
Well, thank you very much, professors. We could go on, but this was... Okay, so this concludes our second American-Spain Symposium, Spain and the Birth of American Diplomacy. I really hope you have all enjoyed listening to these distinguished scholars discuss the complex decision taken by the Spanish monarchy during the 18th century, a time like today of intricate global geopolitics. Thank you very much for your interest in the crucial role played by all the actors at this time: Peninsular Spanish, American Spanish soldiers, sailors, officers, spies, diplomats, civil servants, Native nations, Afro-Americans at the time of the American Revolution. The Institute extends its warmest appreciation to each one of these brilliant scholars. It is now my pleasure to announce the launch of the inaugural QSSI IE Universidad American Spain 250 Humanities Scholarship. IE Universidad is a leading private Spanish university with campuses in Madrid and Segovia. The Queen Sofia Spanish Institute America and Spain 250 Humanities Scholarship has been established for students who demonstrate a firm interest to study the cultural and historical connection between Spain, the Spanish-speaking world, and the United States in order to foster cross-cultural understanding. The inaugural scholarship, launched for the 2026-2027 academic year, has been established to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the independence of the United States. Eligibility requirement and other information will be found on the QSSI and IE School of Humanities website. Finally, We invite you to continue to be a part, alongside the QSSI, of this journey, a journey that seeks to give visibility to the foundational contributions of Hispanics to the establishment of the United States. This journey will take us to Alabama, to New Orleans, where I hope many of you will join during next year's third Symposium, American Spain 250, and to Miami, where the Institute will hold its Sophia Award for Excellence Gala and organize another academic event celebrating the role of the two Floridas and the Caribbean during the American Revolution. The QSSI is honored to have worked with such distinguished partners and expresses its deep gratitude to the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Fundación Ramón Areces. We will now listen to President General Storage close the second symposium. Thank you.
Hasn't this been a tremendous conference? Yeah. Thank you all so much for attending the Spain and the Birth of American Democracy Symposium here at DAR Constitution Hall. We want to express our sincere appreciation to Her Majesty Queen Sophia for joining us and making this event all that more special. Please also join me in giving a round of applause to all the distinguished speakers who presented over the past 2 days. Thank you. These historians and scholars have truly illuminated the crucial, yet often overlooked contributions of Spain to the American Revolution. What an outstanding way to begin to celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. We also want to recognize the outstanding leadership of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, specifically Pilar Yaddo and Begoña Santos, the Ramón Areces Foundation, and the Embassy of Spain to the United States in the academic planning and execution of this symposium. It has been an honor collaborating with these individuals and groups on this very special event. We hope you have all enjoyed the symposium, and I extend my sincere appreciation to the daughters of the American Revolution members who came out to be with us for the last 2 days. They've come from all over the United States and Spain and England. So I hope you have learned a lot. I hope you will take what you have learned back to your communities and continue to share the news and the story about Spain's involvement in the American Revolution. Please come back to visit us in the future and utilize our DAR library and online genealogical resources and learn more about our organization, the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, at our website, www.dar.org. Thank you and enjoy your evening.